It's really important that businesses and entrepreneurs, even consultants, understand what's at stake when as it comes to climate change. Often the environment and the economy are pitted against each other. Um, and that's unfortunate because we need all of these natural resources, not just for our businesses, but nature needs them, needs it itself. But every time we transform land, move energy around, and advance technology, there are consequences. Sometimes policy tools can be used to help regulate an industry to protect those resources so that the rest of society can use it. So that was exciting that we were able to legislate that. But this kind of was in lockstep with energy benchmarking that had been championed by Chicago since 2013. And so energy benchmarking was the city's first kind of approach to understanding the energy needs of the buildings within the city and working towards ensuring that those buildings had the capacity to be adapted for energy efficiency and reduce the carbon footprint of operating in Chicago. So you have to think, like, here we have cannabis, which is really, really expensive in terms of energy, growing at the same time that the city and the state and many other states are thinking more wisely about energy efficiency and reducing their carbon footprint, reducing reliability on non-renewable resources. And it was important to not let this industry jump, kind of not jump the gun, but start so far behind. I'm very proud of this. However, we do have some way to go because we don't have lots of our craft growers in operation. I think there are 17 out of 87. We currently do not know the true need and cost of energy efficiency for our craft grows. And then we'll also get into a little bit of the resources that are made available here at the state level for energy efficiency. But for the most part, Chicago wanted to reduce energy, save utility costs, and support clean energy jobs. And with this industry, I do believe that it can be in lockstep with it. So this is our beautiful planet, you all. It's amazing that we get to be still while the earth is moving, but I just want you to, wrap your mind around, do you understand how we have the resources that we currently have? We hear the term climate change often, or the climate crisis, but do we really recognize how we have transformed land? Do you, as a human being, not just a cannabis professional, really get what we mean when we say climate change and carbon footprint, and why it's so important to capture carbon storage, carbon sinks, carbon sources? So I am going to provide a bit of scientific basis so that you can understand what that terminology means, because it is that important. So first, our world is made up of green and blue. We have vegetation and we have water. Everything that we have here on Earth cycles through. When we transform our landscapes, when we redirect water, when we pull out, minerals and natural gas from beneath the earth and remove vegetation at the scale and the time frame, the short time frame that we have, you end up with an imbalance of carbon stored on Earth and into the atmosphere. A lot of this has happened because we have mechanized, and so industry has transformed how it is that we eat, how we move, how we manage our waste, where we build, and where we live. But that requires energy, and we have adapted in ways that have allowed for us to extract energy in millions and millions of gallons of oil, and it provides the fuel for our economy, right? Our manufacturing companies need energy. Our homes need energy. We use energy to, fly across to go to other cannabis conferences. If you've ever traveled to Benzinga in Florida, or any of the other cannabis conferences in Las Vegas, all of that requires energy. The packaging for your cannabis products, literally everything that we have needs some energy. And so producing it has always been a challenge. The way that we get energy right now is very dirty. It's non-renewable. So these fossil fuels are pulled from under the ground. They are manufactured to be used in different ways. We get plastic materials out of it. And so while on some level, producing energy has allowed for our economy to grow, it has created a huge problem, because the very system that is required to take carbon out of the atmosphere and store it for a long period of time has also been removed. So not only are we digging up, the ground and removing trees, but we also are taking those centuries old compressed organic materials that cannot be replaced in our lifetime. And I mean, we get these beautiful cities, but don't let don't let the smooth taste fool you. All of our cities are at the position of, how do we grow economically? How do we grow our population while making sure that the resources here are clean, they are sustainable, and we can continue to grow without coming into conflict with nature. So how does this work? I want to start off with, I apologize for the science, but it's absolutely necessary, you all. How does the atmosphere work? We have 5 layers to our atmosphere. You may remember, so I'm 43, back in the day, we were talking about the hole in the ozone layer. The hole in the ozone layer happens in the stratosphere. And this is where our satellites orbit. That layer protects us from ultraviolet entering into our atmosphere and burning us up. And so if you recall, that hole in the ozone layer, because that's where ozone protects us, was being eroded away from a source of chemicals called chlorofluorocarbons, refrigerants. And around the world, societies came together with policies that regulated the phasing out of that chemical, subsidies to help industries afford to do that. And slowly but surely, that ozone hole started to close. We are not 100% there. It's interesting how the narrative of the narrative of that is success, but that hole is still there, and we still are compromised, but we have bigger problems a little closer to Earth's surface. And that's in our troposphere. This is the layer that we breathe. This is the layer that's experiencing the most trauma. And this is the layer that your business is operating in. And we're going to talk a little bit about it. And so when we discuss climate change, especially for those who are in a industry that requires plants, you need to understand atmospheric chemistry. Whether you're trying to grow indoors or you're sourcing your plant material from a grow, they are maintaining their internal atmosphere. And those that are growing outdoors are susceptible to the air chemistry that they get, which is a mix of local air chemistry, what's going on, and then air movement, depending on where industry is, depending on if there are big buildings or mountains, things mix in the air. There's acid rain, lots of yucky stuff outside. So growing indoors is much more manageable, but we exist on the outside, and even growing indoors is causing a problem. So our makeup of air is mostly nitrogen, inactive nitrogen, a smaller percentage of oxygen, argon, and then trace presence of other gases, which includes carbon dioxide. So how does all of this work? We have carbon dioxide in the atmosphere that is unusable. Plants need that carbon dioxide in order to grow. And so between sunlight and carbon dioxide and water, those plants take inorganic gases, inert gases, and turn it into biomass, meaning they use it for creating carbon for their roots, shoots, leaves, stems, fruits. And that process of photosynthesis then turns into a byproduct of oxygen and glucose, which is sugar. So this is easy, right? All green things do this. Green things are the foundation of our system. Without vegetation, without plants, without trees, this process is interrupted. What we're seeing now is that agriculture has removed more vegetation, more trees, more forests than any other industry. And we remove forests and we create pastures for animals, we create buildings for people to live in, and we create warehouses and factories for us to produce other products and goods. The problem with this is that we do not have the plants that are taking the carbon out of the atmosphere and storing it into their plant parts. We just have an abundance of carbon moving in one direction. So when we talk about climate change and greenhouse gases, this is just a mass imbalance of carbon. We have more carbon in the atmosphere than we have in terrestrial form, in plant form, and we have removed the vegetation that is responsible for capturing the carbon and doing other things with it, like storing it in the soil or underground for millions of years to prevent the earth from having this positive feedback and of increasing temperature. And so we have done this. We have created this imbalance. And so what does climate change have to do with cannabis? Well, if plants are the primary source of energy and food and regulating carbon within the atmosphere, it has an effect on every other living thing, whether that is if you are a company that's interested in insect protein and cannabis, because I'm quite sure there's somebody out there. If the insects that you think are most valuable for your company are becoming increasingly rare or sick because of what's happening with their food source, that impacts you, right? If we are consuming animals, well, we're not eating foxes, right? But the way that we grow our plants for who's going to consume it, like, are we growing corn to make biodiesel? Are we growing corn to make feed for our livestock? That corn might not necessarily provide the same type of service as if we were to return that pasture or that farm to an actual forest. So I hope that wasn't too much. So trees are really important. And a part of me really wants those in the cannabis sector to understand just how significant an influence the industry can be, primarily because farmers are really powerful within our legislative networks. They bring in billions of dollars of money to states and regions. They are highly unregulated and heavily subsidized. All of the things that are somewhat different from those who are working in cannabis, which hopefully, once this becomes federally legal, those resources and subsidies for cannabis to be efficient and in lockstep with conservation of resources for growing, that will happen. All right, so now we move on to, hopefully you have a better understanding of cannabis a bit. We got people from Chicago, Elmwood Park. Thank you so much for joining me. And even in our very long state, our climate can be, or our experience of our weather can be very different. And so like rural Illinois, central Illinois, definitely can experience drought differently because they're more, more agricultural. They need that water, versus a place like Chicago and the Metro land where our experience of uncomfortable weather or drought is really dependent on your income, right? Like, do you have access to a place that you can stay cool? You might have better access to infrastructure that allows for you to constantly have water. And so we all don't have the same experience, even in the same state. And your businesses might be impacted differently, especially because of urban flooding and sewage lines in certain counties, for example. So carbon dioxide has been steadily increasing over the years, right? We have pulled up vegetation. We have extracted energy from natural gas and oil reserves from underneath the earth, and we are pumping them out at most insane rates. And I like this quote at the bottom: if supply chains don't get reshaped as a way to deal with global warming, the impacts on the economy will be much worse. It is necessary. It is, if you are starting a business, I don't care what sector, I don't care who you are, where you're operating, it is absolutely critical that you have an understanding of how the supply chain is being impacted by global warming. The vendors that you choose, the consultants that you hire, where it is that you decide to sign a contract. This is requiring people to have a higher level of intelligence more than ever before. And you can't just count on somebody else educating you. You really do need to have a grasp in and of yourself for you personally and your business. So we're going to talk a little bit about how does cannabis contribute to excess carbon in our atmosphere? How has the industry been adapting, and what ways companies can be climate allies? And so I don't want you to get overwhelmed, right? Like, this is, for some, it might be a reminder to double down on a process of understanding how can your company be a climate ally. This may be absolutely new, like, wait, what just happened? But these lessons have been promoted to the public in many different ways. It may be through transportation conversations. It might be through health equity. You may have heard this, from food and food security. You may have heard this from disaster preparedness. And so what I do hope is that every time you hear a little bit more about climate change and, carbon imbalance, that a little bit more sticks, and you can become a little bit more intelligent with how it is you process that information and make decisions for your company, because that's going to make the difference between the winners and the losers. The people who can make the best decision with the highest quality of information the fastest. And the more educated you are, the more global awareness or your ability to scale and understand patterns and trends, the better. All right, so who knew that weed would be so carbon intensive? About an ounce of dry flower can generate more carbon, CO2 emissions than a road trip from Chicago to Champaign. And that's about 135 miles. So about the same amount of carbon is produced from that creation of that dried flower as driving to Champaign. Smoking 10 joints has the potential to emit the same amount of carbon as if you consumed an 8-ounce steak. So you have to think that that steak was a part of a living animal, right? And that animal received water, and that animal received food, that animal had a place to live. And so when these types of connections are made, it is the same amount of carbon went into making 10 joints as making that steak that you're consuming from that animal. And then a report from some engineers at Colorado State University found that 5.5 tons of carbon dioxide equivalent in a kilogram of dried weed. And that's a lot of carbon. So Summers and her peers really did the industry a service by articulating and showing the carbon footprint of cannabis. And so here we have a graph that is adapted from that article, carbon footprint of marijuana versus variety of food items. And so this is in kilograms. So we see like right here, we have weed grown indoors in Hawaii. So a 3.5 grams. Indoor grown in Colorado is slightly lower. And so you might think like, oh, well, it's not that significant, but why are there energy differences if the marijuana is the same? Well, you have to think that these are very different places, and their energy needs also are different in terms of how they have to maintain their indoor facility based on what's happening outside. And so we're right there. We're almost there with, you know, a hamburger. Well, we meaning the industry. And here we have Long Beach, California versus grown indoors. This is a smaller amount right here in Hawaii, but it can absolutely range. But the idea that the same amount of carbon goes into producing a joint that we don't hear people talking about reduce your carbon footprint with your weed, but we do on the hey, we need to stop consuming so much animal protein, or the way that we raise our cattle needs to be more carbon mindful. We're not having the same conversations, even though we are emitting equal, or somewhat equal amounts of carbon. And so growing weed indoors can produce more carbon than it is for, flights, some of the longest flights in the world, which I also think is kind of telling, that we have some work to do if we want this industry to be seen as a positive. Everybody may not be able to afford to be efficient and as carbon mindful, but I do think that I think after this election season, and I think after the disasters that we're seeing back to back, people are much more mindful about how can we be a part of the solution, and what is it going to cost us? So what makes cannabis so carbon producing and so carbon rich? Energy, right? Energy intensive HVAC systems, and these will regulate temperature, humidity, optimal growing conditions 24/7, right? Electricity for grow lights at various stages, as well as other technologies like security and surveillance equipment. And then also grows will often add additional carbon dioxide, but ultimately it is policies. In the state of Illinois, you have no choice but to grow indoors. Now, if we grew outdoors, it might be expensive in a different kind of way in terms of water, nutrient management, fertilizer, and pest management. But right now, because of security reasons, and this is federally illegal, and this is a $1 billion industry in the state, you have to protect it. And so we have heard, we meaning on the environmental side, have heard some of the MSOs begin to talk about lobbying to grow outdoors. What would it look like? How much money could it save? And how could it help Illinois be on track for being carbon neutral, or reducing reducing the state's energy footprint if the industry were allowed to move outdoors in some way? So every state is different. I think this is important for those of you who are considering operating in various states. Just know that each of those states and regions of the state will have its own weather patterns and shifts in climate and policies attached to them. So this is what I mean about your company is going to have to be able to think broadly, make connections, and be extremely strategic. You may feel, you know what? If we're growers, there's no way we're gonna bank on Great Lakes growing, because we see where this is going. places like Texas, Arizona that are experiencing these dramatic droughts and unfortunate flash floods, we know that they're running out of water. Why would we put our grow there? And even if we could afford to do it, is that where the people are going to be? And what is this experience going to be like over the next 10 years with climate change? So this is a map that shows the uh, um, greenhouse gas emission by states. And so energy needs are influenced by local climate conditions. And so here, like you absolutely get heat. It's cold, but we are moving to a era where we're seeing air conditioning has to be a part of your infrastructure. For example, it's not mandated, but when former Mayor Rahm Emanuel took office, he promised that all students would have access to air conditioning. The problem with that was that our school buildings were so old, like 100 years old. It was really, really expensive to retrofit. And so they would get air conditioning units, but the units also required the energy grid to be updated. And so we're always in this battle of, comfort, policies, energy costs, carbon dioxide, production. Every sector, every industry is kind of in this space. But I think these are important kind of contexts for you all to know as business owners in this climate era. It's one of the most volatile, underfunded, heavily regulated eras of our economy ever. However, I do think that women are a unique stakeholder group that can solve problems in different ways. And I think that's what excites me, is seeing how many women are at the forefront of the climate change fight, that are on boards with sustainability mindsets and bringing solutions that protect profits. All right, so my recommendations and some reminders that there are both social and economic impacts to climate change, and your company has to think about them all for your business as a business entity and how it intersects within the geography that it lives in, your employees. It does matter. So for example, if you find a location for a warehouse and it's a steel, but you didn't realize that this county floods and flash floods, and what are your policies to protect your employees? What types of investments need to be made to manage stormwater? Will you still commit to being in a place or in a city or a county that they do not have the adequate energy grid system for you to operate and scale? So in terms of geographically, the cost of adapting in coastal areas is going to be rising along with sea level. Anywhere near water, even if it's a lake, even if it's a man-made lake, water can breach and flood. And you also want to be cognizant of your proximity to natural lowlands and wetlands. There are advocacy initiatives for returning wetlands, and so that's something to think about. There are relocations of entire towns. And so I think in that respect, there are areas within states that state government or federal governments have approved a certain amount of money to evacuate or remove people. And so if you're thinking this will be a great place to put a dispensary, you're not considering all of the other factors within a 50-mile radius, then you very well could set yourself up to be next to some ghost towns, and not because you made a bad decision, but because the realities of climate change are impacting that local community and the resources that they have access to. Shrinking productivity of harvests. And so for those, I think when I gave this talk a couple of weeks ago, people that use chocolate, for example, we are seeing certain fruits and certain commodities be negatively impacted, whether it's too hot, it's too dry, it's not, there's not enough, I think there's like a cloud forest, and like clouds even benefit like vineyards, like If you are working in the edible space, you have some strategizing to do. You have some pivoting to do. You have some scenario planning to do, because if you are relying on resources traveling from far away, you could find yourself in a bit of a bottleneck. I do like that cannabis allows for the promotion of local food production and working locally within your region to kind of reduce that transportation carbon emission. But at the same time, novel solutions like electric vehicles emerge, and alternative recipes that I think would be interesting to see. So prices of basic foodstuffs and consumer goods will continue to rise, so it becomes expensive for you to operate. We do not know the impacts of climate change on vulnerable populations and how they will be arriving. And so if we're thinking that this, this product is medicine, are we open to considering as wages go down, what does that mean for our products as our population becomes increasingly poor? But still in need of these resources, can the industry or can your company adapt to having lower priced products for a range of budgets? Fresh water will be in short supply. We're already seeing that. The Great Lakes is the place to be. I'm going to say it again. The Great Lakes is the place to be. Don't leave. There will be increasing conflict. We're seeing this now. And the conflict may be local. Like right now, there are cities on the outside of the Great Lakes Water Basin that are trying to petition Chicago to buy water. The village of Barrington, I believe, is running out of well water. And so that conflict might be like stateside, but it will, more people will be asking Chicago to sell them water than ever before. Loss of capacity due to heat. And so this seasonal, our seasonal issues can cause changes in how much it costs to operate, or just if it's healthy even to be outside. We had the Canadian, and I'm almost at time. We had the Canadian wildfires, right? And being outside for like 5 minutes or 10 minutes was the equivalent of smoking like 6 to 10 packs of cigarettes. Right. So things that are happening in our environment that compromise our environment, that make it unhealthy to be outside, can very well be a Debbie Downer for the industry, especially for combustible products. I don't want to be all gloom and doom, because solutions are emerging. And the question is how will you be a part of the solutions network? There will be additional sustainability professionals needed. And how you bring that into your team can happen in lots of different ways. Oh, I'm going to put that there because I spelled that wrong. There are lots of different articles that talk about how companies are combating climate change. There are some that are required to operate in certain ways. And so we have our legislation here in Illinois. Really happy that New York State kind of like followed our lead and have an actual research program to focus on environmental sustainability for energy in the cannabis industry. And I think that's phenomenal. Like, they definitely have surpassed us, and we need this. And then there's the circular economy, understanding how it is that waste can turn into a resource. And so there are many, many businesses that are like, we are environmentally friendly. And even if we started a laundromat, we would have had the same ethics. But having this type of insight can be costly. If you don't have it or possess it yourself, then you are hiring someone or working with a consulting firm that specializes in these types of issues. Also, our friend industrial hemp is showing up like, hold my beer. Industrial hemp is being researched as a unique carbon storage solution. It grows fast. It grows on low quality soil. It grows with in drought conditions. However, because things are living and life is dynamic, even this amazing plant has its limitations. And so I gave a talk some time ago about hemp being a huge opportunity for Black farmers. However, most Black farmers, 80% of Black farms are located south of the Mason-Dixie line. These are the areas that will be increasing in their vulnerability to drought. I think Texas has the most Black farmers, but also has a high a high vulnerability index. And even though we can turn these into building materials, it still costs energy to produce. And so, yep, we can grow hemp and we can grow it, and the environment is kind of wonky. But if conditions are not optimal, if it's too hot, too dry, too wet, too cold, even hemp is going to be negatively impacted. Yes, you can take the biomass and take that carbon and turn it into building materials, but you still have to have energy to turn those, turn that biomass into material. I added this graph because, as people talk about the agricultural supply chain and the Black economy, and still agriculture is at the foundation, of our supply chain. Like, things come from the earth and we turn them into secondary products. But look to see where those family farms are, right? Like, they're coastal. And those coastal communities are, hurricane season is wild. And so if we have a large percentage of Black farms that are in high risk zones and areas, we do have to think critically about, yeah, we wanted this supply chain to be, to be diverse, but where these farms are located, their commodities are going to be increasingly expensive. They might not even be able to, harvest or grow because of what they're experiencing due to climate change. My other recommendation is to understand climate goals where you produce, store, and sell. So here in Chicago, we do have the Climate Action Plan. Some cities do not have this kind of overarching plan for adapting to climate change, reducing their carbon footprint. I think it is valuable for you to be educated what your state is saying it's trying to do, what the county you're operating in is trying to do, and what the city that you are operating in is trying to do. Now, yes, you do have to do this for multiple areas if you're in multiple states or multiple regions, but I think it is the wisest thing to do to understand how it is that that cities, counties, and state organizations and government agencies are looking to reduce their footprint. It also can give you insight on the types of resources that may be available. Which brings me to CEJA. I do not know if you are familiar with the Climate and Equitable Jobs Act that was signed into law by a range of stakeholders, including labor and environment, folks in energy, transportation, workforce development. I mean, it was other states are looking at this piece of legislation that we passed, and it was it was overdue, but they got it done. It incentivizes renewable energy development, accelerates electric vehicle adoption and charging infrastructure for cars. I remember when I asked someone from CEJA, I said, "Are cannabis businesses eligible?" And they were like, "Yes." And so I'm not quite sure which pieces of CEJA, whether that is in energy efficiency or identifying a contractor that has resources that they have access to make it cheaper for you as a business. It is worth it to explore how CEJA can help your company become a little bit more energy efficient, and look for these types of opportunities in other states as well if you plan on moving outside of Illinois. Last slide: learn, prepare, adapt, invest wisely. I do want to take some time just to honor those who are trying to evacuate from Florida right now due to Hurricane Milton. I have family in Florida. This is very personal for me. I went to Florida A&M. I have a deep respect for people who say this is my home, but this is our reality. We are here able to talk about this industry and think, what's happening really, really far away. But we will feel this here in Chicago in some ways. And I think it's important to keep your ears tuned in, continue to be educated on how states are responding to climate disasters, because you very well want to identify what ways where you operate. You're like, okay, I want to be a voice. I want to begin speaking with peers about, in the event of disasters, how is it that we work collaboratively and help each other? The disasters that we are most faced with are flooding, tornadoes, and ice storms, as well as extreme heat. So yeah, I will stop there and thank you all so much.
Thank you for that. That was such a wonderful kind of wonderful session in general, but I think we don't necessarily hear enough about environmental sustainability and climate change in cannabis for such an agricultural industry. I feel like it has been kind of a taboo topic because we don't want to talk about some of the negative ramifications of such a medically necessary industry. So I do really appreciate this session. Has been wonderful.
Yeah, you're welcome.
And I want to jump to the Q&A. We have a few minutes. And I do have some questions myself as well. So
Yeah.
so kind of as people would like to throw questions in the chat, I will throw out some of my own. You mentioned legislation. You mentioned Illinois has some things in place. New York has started to adapt things as well. What are some things that have been put in place legislatively that we should keep at top of mind? And also, what are ways that we can advocate as we see climate change heavily impacting us on a daily basis at this point?
Okay, so let me get, the first thing is we, in House Bill 1438, it requires those seeking a craft grow to explain their waste management, their water, energy efficiency, in order for Department of Agriculture to approve their application. So in that regard, IDOA is responsible for saying, we accept your plans. Now, there are strong recommendations, but we know that every business has different capital. And so the way that they can accomplish their goals will look a little different and take different timelines. So it's not a hard and fast rule like, okay, by 2026, hotels have to stop offering small single-use shampoo bottles. And event facilities that hold 3,500 people or more have to provide, recycling and composting for their patrons. And I think we're moving towards a ban on styrofoam, right? And so there are these bigger environmental pieces of legislation that the environmental and conservation community in the state are advocating for that very well may compromise how it is that you've decided to do your business. And so in that regard, I do think it is wise. So Illinois Environmental Council represents over 200 businesses, nonprofits that focus on a range of resources and organisms. I mean, there are people that are, supporting fish habitat, and then there are people that support migratory birds. But we all are on the same page with, we can't allow this project or we can't allow this contaminant within the water system. So the craft grow license requires you to communicate your plan. As far as the resources to accomplish that, I do think that the way that cannabis can articulate capital needs is connected to the environment, right? Like, it's in competition. This is my personal opinion. When people lobby for cannabis and access to capital, it sounds very self-serving, right? Like, you need to give us access so our private business, which is federally illegal, can grow. And we can show that this economy can be valuable for the state. It's a different conversation to say, we need capital to develop our facilities in alignment with the state's and conservation organizations' vision for industries operating in the Great Lakes. We need to make sure that these buildings are built the first time as efficient and environmentally friendly and even more progressive. And so what does it look like to use cannabis as a pilot for how do you piecemeal your energy subsidies? How do you piecemeal your building and construction materials and waste reuse? And can we accomplish this and be, highly sustainable? That's a different conversation, right? You're taking something and saying, hey, proof of concept, we're using this money, we can show how to do this. I think that the industry can be really successful with those types of conversations, but it requires the cannabis sector to, one, not have the spirit of fear of being regulated similar to farmers, right? Like, because I don't know how many cannabis folks are a part of the Illinois Farm Bureau. I don't know how many cannabis growers consider themselves farmers, but mentally and kind of like the approach with policies are very similar in some ways to agriculture. Don't want to be regulated, even though we know that the production, manufacturing, and the selling of these products contribute to environmental harm, making it more expensive for everybody to work, live, and play in this state. And so I think a holistic approach is necessary. And then looking at states that do have those recommendations for operating very mindfully. I didn't know New York State had that. Matter, I didn't know that they had a research program to ensure sustainability and energy efficiency. I think it's those types of points that also need to be articulated by the cannabis industry. Where's our research agenda, right, for sustainability and not just social equity? Because you can't tell me that environmental injustice and social equity don't go hand in hand. That's absolutely absurd, right? So I think there are opportunities for environmental equity, especially in waste production. So those will be, some of my thoughts.
And then we had one question in the chat as well, kind of talking through the fact that we, instead of avoiding these conversations as an industry, we need to start to face them. How can we all get on board and adapt to being more environmentally responsible, and thinking through the cost of that for businesses like social equity businesses that are already struggling financially to sustain themselves? How will that impact them as well?
So the first is, to be clear, every industry is in this position, right? Like, even though cannabis is fairly new, think about the industries that should have been environmentally friendly. I'll give you an example. Your lawn care professional. Your lawn care professional should have been able to introduce environmentally friendly products and services, and without policies telling them. Why haven't they done so? Because it's too what? Expensive, right? So this is not cheap for anybody. I think the industry shows itself more uh not more, shows itself less tone deaf to, we're not special, we're not immune to any of this. However, the capital we produce can be a part of the solution. Now that's where it gets interesting. Do not have any research that says, all right, if you take us off the leash, how much capital can we generate, and how many clean energy programs can be subsidized based on the taxes that are generated by cannabis, right? Like, what type of water infrastructure projects can we afford to do in the state if we were allowed to hire the missing 2,500 people that should be employed but can't because these businesses can't get operational? How do we leverage, the federal government is providing what, $13 billion for the microchip industry, right? To subsidize it so that it can, grow and provide jobs, and also remove environmental reviews. The federal government has subsidized industries in order to boost the economy. I think our economic argument needs to be much more sophisticated. It needs to intersect with some of these other policies that are environmentally focused. I think water and energy and waste are really critical. And because there's so much produced because of policies, you can get people's attention. Environmental inequity and environmental justice is still kind of growing. It would be really dope to understand how the industry can help shine a light on bad actors. And this isn't a case of like point the finger so people stop looking at you. Cannabis had no other choice but to exist how it does because there's no capital, it's federally illegal, and people are bootstrapping this. But because it can produce so much money, it can actually dig itself out its own hole. And I think that's what's so brilliant about it. Unlike agriculture that requires federal subsidies in order for that industry to exist, cannabis can be somewhat self-sufficient and profitable with a decreasing amount of subsidies from the federal government. So we get to move out of mom's house faster if they just, you know, support us a little bit and let us function. I do think your network matters. And so there's a symposium I strongly encourage you to attend. It's called the Cannabis Sustainability Symposium. It is literally all things ESG, water, waste, energy, transportation, all of it. It is nothing about how like the regular way that we talk about weed. It is very, very focused on all things sustainability. And so I would say attend, meet people, because that's where you're going to meet the practitioners and the policymakers that will be able to bridge the gap. And also find other folks, you know, locally that are in environmental and conservation programs. You all are responsible for educating everybody. You have to educate bankers, you have to educate the conservation space, because I have permission in my role at my organization to continue to engage because this is an agricultural commodity. And there are publications on Sierra Club National's perspective on cannabis as a growing industry. You have to cultivate a diverse network in order to stay in tune. That would be the least costly way, is to grow your diverse network of environmental professionals, attend conversations and look for opportunities where cannabis and natural resources and energy and waste are being discussed. And also, when you have the opportunity to speak up, say, what about the environmental aspect of it? How does this fit into it? Who should be here at the table?
Thank you. No, that is, I think you've really got everything in a nutshell. Not surprising. I truly appreciated this conversation. I could continue having it all day. And I would love to kind of offline talk about how we can continue this in our programming and really get this education out there because it is lacking. And I want to make sure that at least within our network, we can continue spreading this awareness. So thank you again for your time. Thank you for this session. We are a little bit over, so we're just going to jump straight into the next one. So thank you again, Dr. Mila Marshall.